Yeah, Talaman, Geek Talk. Let's enjoy the show. Talaman always got a plan. Geek Talk is popping where it's really at. Represents geek culture, homie got structure. Sometimes it's bogus, real cats culture. Feel like Goofy, smart to say the least. Loving One Piece, man, really loves to eat. Everybody knows the show is really is Talaman. You know what time it is. Let's go, Geek Talk.
Hello and welcome. We got another episode of Geek Talk with Tyler, and as always, I am your host, Tyler. Today I'll be joined by my guest, Zhao Chen. Zhao, how are you doing today?
Good. How about yourself?
Can't complain. Before we go any further, you want to tell the audience a bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, where you can be found?
Sure. I'm Chinese American. I'm based in Tokyo, Japan. I work as a business risk consultant in Japan, looking at foreign companies who wants to invest in this country.
Nice, that's awesome. And if people want to get a hold of you, so you can be a part of their episode as well, where are you found?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter. It's my first name, last name, Xiaochen Su. You can also find me on Facebook or LinkedIn. So I can give the description below the video so that you can find me online after watching this podcast.
Terrific. Our episode today is dedicated to all you anime fans who at some point would love to go to Japan. So I brought Zhao Chen over here to talk about what would be like to vacation in Japan if you are an anime fan. Specifically, vacationing for geeks in Japan. Now, Zhao, how long have you been stationed in Japan?
So I actually grew up in the country. I spent almost 6 years of my elementary school here, and since 2017, I have been back in the country. I was doing a PhD program before graduating in 2021 and starting my current job. So it has been like 5 years since I've been back in the country.
That sounds right, based on my math.
Yeah.
So, it's no secret that many anime today take place in modern Japan, or they be the slice of lifers, the action, even the comedy ones. But my question is, do you believe that Western media portrays Japan well to the same degree?
Very interesting. When you look at anime, it portrays Japan in a certain way that's, of course, a little bit different from reality. Anime creates a world that is either too optimistic or too pessimistic, depending on what is the theme of the anime and what is the main message that the anime is trying to convey. Of course, real life is slightly more boring than that. It's not as extreme. There are, of course, good parts and bad parts about how how Japan is actually like in real life, and that's quite different from anime. Unfortunately, Western media takes a lot of the stance of many anime series in that it tends to portray Japan in extreme ways that's a little bit distorted from reality. A good example is how Western media seems to see Japanese culture as very idiosyncratic, very unique, and very different from Western culture in many particular ways. This is especially with regard to personal etiquette, the cuisine, how people believe their relationship is with the world outside of their country. All of these tend to be portrayed as very different. But in fact, if you live here for years, you tend to realize that normal people are not all that different from your average Joe in the US, for instance. People think quite alike. And I do wonder where all that kind of a bias and prejudice come from in Western media.
Well, to be fair, the U.S. Has kind of got an ego problem where they think, oh, we're the USA, we're the top dogs of the world. So it's not just Japan, it's also several parts of Europe, Africa, other parts of Asia, etc., etc., etc. So I do agree
Yeah.
with you on that. America does have an ego complex. So you're not wrong on that. But as far as Western
Yep.
media goes, many shows have been inspired by Japanese culture, whether it's Avatar The Last Airbender, Samurai Jack,
Mhm.
Jackie Chan Adventures, and many more, several more to name. What are your thoughts on cartoons, and I say cartoons because that's what they are, that have been
Yeah.
inspired by anime and other forms of Japanese culture?
I think with regard to the visual design aspect, there are certainly a lot of similarities between Japanese anime and a lot of the cartoons that you see on American TV and just Western TV in general today. A lot of the visual designs share the same heritage, and there are a lot of design cues that are using anime that is also used in shows like Jackie Chan Adventure, for instance. But in terms of the storyline, there is a lot more difference, right? Of course, American cartoons, the main audience is, of course, American, who are from quite a different cultural heritage and social background as your average Japanese teenager or children. In terms of creating certain values or trying to sort of convey a message of certain ideologies, American cartoons can be quite different from Japanese anime. I guess the interesting example would be how Pokemon is sort of interpreted in American media versus a Japanese one. I grew up watching Pokemon in the US as well. So I kind of get the sense of how the public talks about the show. And most often it's about the independence of the main character, Ash Ketchum, right? And the adventures that he goes to become Pokemon Master. Of course, on the Japanese side, the same message is there. Of course, people believe that, okay, this kid is going on an adventure and people do want to be more independent like him and fulfill their dreams, right? So there is similarity there. But in the Japanese context, aside from the independence of the main protagonist, there is also a side story about how he is helped by different people along the way, right? So at the end, it's not him just being himself and being independent, but he is actually part of this larger community. And the fact that he can do all he does in terms of his adventures, becoming a better Pokemon trainer, happens because he is part of this community that he often feels that he's different from. But at the end, he realizes that, okay, without all the people's support, all these people who that he come in contact with during his journeys, he will never become what he became at the very end. So the emphasis on the community is a lot stronger in the Japanese context, even with the same show as Pokemon. Yeah.
Well, actually, I'm not sure if you heard, but Ash Ketchum's no longer the protagonist. He
Yeah,
just
indeed.
completed the last World Cup that he needed to, and then he's going to step down. There's going to be, or at least as of this recording, there will be an 11-part series, and then we're going to focus on a new protagonist, who, funny
Yep.
enough, strangely bears a resemblance to the 10-year-old we've known for over 20 years.
Yeah, it's kind of sad because, of course, here in Japan, people have heard the news and they're equally sad that Ash Ketchum is departing the show. A lot of people, myself included, grew up with the show and certainly find it hard to believe that there will be a different protagonist for the next generation of viewers. But I guess the show has to innovate after all these years of basically applying the same formula. So it doesn't make sense from a business point of view.
It does. I mean, the only thing we can probably equate to that is if The Simpsons or even Family Guy stepped down. Well, Family Guy did
Right.
take a break, so I guess Simpsons would be a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
more apropos. Or I guess
Yeah.
in the case of you One Piece fans, if Luffy actually finds the One Piece, which that's
Yeah,
something
absolutely.
so mind blowing how it's still able to rock my world even after 20 some odd years. Now,
Mm.
it's true that One Piece is more popular in Japan than it is pretty much anywhere else in the world. Would you agree on that?
I would say so, but I think this is more of a general comment, not really about One Piece, but about anime in general, right? I think I grew up in the U.S. watching cartoons, both Japanese anime and cartoons inspired by Japanese anime, and their target audience seems to be at the end children or teenagers. Right, they're not targeted toward adults, but in the Japanese context, anime and manga is quite diverse in terms of its intended audience. Many of the manga series, in particular, is directly targeted toward adults. Right, they're not for children. The content is about, for example, romance or about workplace. About the business environment. All of these, the children cannot resonate with. They cannot relate to because they have no life experiences in that field yet, right? So a lot of these manga, they go for the adult audience. And for something like One Piece, it is watched by both adults and children. And of course, it's the same content, but adults and children do take away different messages from the same content. So I think that is something that's quite different about anime and manga in Japan as compared to cartoons in the US.
Well, I can't English today, excuse me. Intended audience is a very funny thing. For example, My Little Pony. When you think of that, you think the target audience would be little girls, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what one would think. But if you go to any My Little Pony convention, you're going to be surprised how many adult men are there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it really shows you who can be into what fandoms, and that always surprises me, even to this day, as a semi-frequent convention goer. But back to Pokemon, what I've noticed from Pokemon is that many of the Pokemon that exist are based off of Japanese mythology. Whether it's Vulpix and Ninetales representing Kitsune, Eevee representing a Tanuki, or if we can even take that a step further, I believe it is Drowsy and Hypno based on the Baku.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And from time to time, I've noticed that several other anime throw in different forms of mythology. But I guess that would be the equivalent of the Western audience having a unicorn or a Western-inspired dragon on their show.
Right.
So my question is, do you believe Japanese mythology is shown somewhat accurately in anime?
Right. I think this is not really anime, but in real life or just in any sort of media content in Japan as well. Japan's relationship with religion tends to be a very flexible one, even if that is related to the native religion of Shintoism in Japan. So if you look at foreign religion, for instance, Japan's relationship with Christianity and Buddhism tends to be very flexible. Like people get married here with the Christian ceremony, and they have their funerals with the Buddhist ceremony. So you can have both of those as a same individual. There is a lot of religious ceremony attached to both of those practices, but there is not that much significant religious context, right? You're not either a follower of Christianity or you're not a follower of Buddhism. You can be both. The same goes with Shintoism, right? Shintoism at the end is animist religion, which believes that gods exist in every piece of nature that you can find, right? It's in the stones, it's in the rivers, it's in the seas, it's in the trees, it's in the mountains, right? And for different people, Shintoism means different things, right? You can believe in a mountain, but not the river. You can believe in a particular god in the mountain, but not another god in the mountain, right? So how you interpret the religion tends to be very flexible, and that gives a lot of media content a lot of leeway in terms of how religions interpret it. And I think that is how Pokemon is created, right? It's not meant to, of course, there are similarity with the common gods of Shintoism, but it's not meant to exclusively represent certain gods and not the others, right? So depending on how you interpret each individual Pokemon, it can represent multiple gods, right, to different people. So that sort of flexibility in how Japan handles religion in general is sort of resonated in media content like anime and manga series as well.
Well, it's funny how you say Japan has borrowed from the West. I think at this point, both Japan and U.S. borrow things from each other. For those of you that don't know,
absolutely.
a Japanese Christmas is basically ordering a thing of KFC.
Yeah, correct.
And I always
Absolutely
find
right.
the origin of that to be quite hilarious. Was officially sent to Japan in December, became really popular, and then just sort of became the Christmas tradition. So
Yeah.
personally, I find that funny. But
Yeah.
there are many times where people borrow things from other countries, like
Yeah.
in case people would have packaged ramen, specifically college students, but that's not real ramen. Are there any Japanese foods in particular you would recommend for people wanting to start into Japanese cuisine, or are there any personal favorites you have?
Right. I think the starting point is looking at the Japanese food that's served in your neighborhood, right? Before you come to Japan. For instance, in the US, if you go to a Japanese restaurant, there tends to be a lot of fried food, right? Because people like fried food, right? So that would be tempura, for
We
instance.
do. It's America's guilty pastime.
Indeed. Pork cutlets, anything that is fried in Japanese food tends to become pretty popular outside of Japan as well. So, of course, that's a good starting point. You can find good tempura and good fried cutlets, fried chicken, all of that you can find in Japan as well. And they tend to be pretty good as well. But if you go a step beyond that, right, go a little bit off the beaten path of what you normally eat back home, then there are some things that might strike you as quite edible, but at the same time, not too strange, right? You don't want to start with something too strange. A good example is chicken skewers, right? So there are a lot of grilled skewer restaurants in Japan where they put pieces of meat on a stick, right? Usually like a bamboo stick, and grill that over charcoal fire. And people like to have those sticks of meat with their beer, sake, or other types of alcohol for their late night snacks. And that, in itself, the food is very good, right? But it's also an opportunity to bond with people, right? So it's not just about eating, but it's about drinking and talking with people. And usually these restaurants that serve these charcoal meat steaks tend to be quite old and quite atmospheric in a traditional Japanese way. So to be able to visit these kind of restaurants, I think is a good first touch point with Japanese culture in Japan. Yeah.
For those of you that don't know, sake is particularly a rice-based, cannot speak today. It's a rice-based wine. There's a tongue twister for you. And I've actually made a drink with her when I was quick shout out to my tan, or Glennis, at her holiday party last year, or this year as of this recording. I made a drink, which is basically, instead of a rum and Coke, I had a sake and Coke. Because that was available at the time. But it feels like a lot of the times, the businessman in Japan is portrayed as somebody who just goes off and gets drunk, tie around the forehead, and sings karaoke later on. Do you think this is an accurate portrayal?
I think the portrayal is getting a little bit old. So the general portrayal of a Japanese salaryman or a white-collar worker is somebody who wears a very sharp suit during the day, work very long hours, always sort of apologizing and bowing to their customers for good customer service, right? And they work very long hours, so tends to be very stressed. And because of that stress, they tend to, drink a lot, go to karaoke to blow off some steam, right? So that's the traditional portrayal of a Japanese salaryman. But the situation in the country has been changing in the past decade or so. there are a lot of startups here as well, where people do work long hours, but because of their passion, not because of the company's rules, right? And people are no longer sort of restricted in a career that spans decades within one company. There's a lot more changing of jobs in mid-career. And this is something that hasn't happened quite a lot in Japan until the recent decade or so. So the traditional image of the Japanese salaryman, very rigid, very hardworking, and loves to drink, that is kind of becoming a little bit old, right? Of course, there are still people like that, but I think the newer generation, they don't tolerate that kind of situation as well as their as the previous generation of workers.
I can understand that, and I'm going to relate that to Western audiences. I'd say Americans are an interesting yet funny portrayal because what people don't know about the States is that we're not one country. We are actually 50 smaller countries occupying one large existing country. So whether it's the portrayal of Texans being highfalutin cowboys, whether it be Southerners being inbred, or even New Yorkers being rude, going, "Hey, yo, I'm walking over here." So I can understand the exhausting portrayal. I mean, granted, there are people who fit that description, but saying that all people fit that description is a little bit racist. So I understand entirely where you're coming from. But I'm going to talk to you about a second about the dubbed anime that reaches the States. We've had many companies dubbing anime at one point, whether it be 4Kids Media with their Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, and One Piece takes, to Viz Media, to even Funimation, which serves as the most popular and recognized dubbing platform today. Do you believe that America is dubbing Japanese content well?
It's very difficult to say how you define well, because at the end,
let me rephrase that question.
Sure.
Are you familiar with the term westernization?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
For those of you that don't know, westernization is basically when America takes foreign content, which in this case, Japanese animation, and makes it more similar or more recognizable by Western audience. The most famous case out there is Brock's Jelly Donuts.
Yeah.
When in fact he was serving onigiri, and I cannot tell you how much of my childhood was spent looking for a triangle-shaped donut.
Right.
So my question is, do you think it's getting better in terms of compared to the original content?
It's an interesting question, but I mean, Pokemon is a very good example of this because even beyond the Jelly Donut example, all the characters' names, all the Pokemon's names, they have been changed in the English version compared to the original Japanese version, right? That, of course, took a lot of effort, of course, by whoever that decided to translate all of this. They had to create new names for basically every single Pokemon out there and every single human that's in the show as well. But of course, they did this because they felt it was necessary for the show to catch on in the US, right? For kids in the US to relate to Japanese names, it's probably asking a little bit too much of themselves, considering, at their age, their English, their first language might not be all that fluent yet, right? Depending on the age. So for kids, for content that is delivered to kids, the dubbing has to be done from a child's perspective, right? How much can the child comprehend what's in the show, and how the child will comprehend whatever that is being dubbed or being westernized in terms of content, right? So in terms of that child's perspective, I do feel that American companies that do dubbing of Japanese shows tend to do a very good job, right? They try to understand the American children's perspective in terms of what they can understand from the original show and what they cannot understand, right? And they try to keep sort of the original idea of the Japanese anime without making it look too foreign. And the jelly donut is, I guess, a good example in a way, right? So I mean, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, I do believe that the dubbing is done quite well. But of course, everyone has their own opinion on this point.
Well, yeah, everyone has their own opinions on everything.
Yeah.
Like, One Piece will serve as the best manga to ever come out of Japan, but I know several people who either don't like it or for some reason hate it. But with all said and done, the names are definitely getting better in terms of holding to their original content. For example, Naruto, which means whirlpool in Japanese, kept his name, and Ichigo, which
Yeah.
means strawberry, kept his name instead of just being called Whirlpool and Strawberry.
Yeah.
So then that would have to change the name for the Naruto franchise entirely. And here's a little fun fact for you One Piece fans. Sanji's original name was going to be Naruto, but once Oda found out that Kishimoto was writing the manga of the same name, he decided to change it to Sanji to avoid any further confusion.
Interesting.
It's these little fun facts that
Interesting. Yeah.
kind of keep things, well, interesting. I just said the same word twice, but take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
But even then, do you believe shonen anime is too much of a distraction for all the other anime out there? Because a lot of times when people think anime, they usually think of whatever is the big three at the time, whether it be Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, Yu Yu Hakusho, One Piece, Bleach, Naruto, or My Hero Academia, Demon Slayer, and Black Clover, or whatever serves as the big three at the time.
Right. I think a big difference between the US and Japan with regard to how people come in contact with new anime content is quite different, right? So in the US, there are certain distributors, maybe big media companies, big cartoon companies that act as the exclusive distributors of original anime content that's imported from Japan. So people will see these anime contents through big media platforms. But this is not the case in Japan, where there are a lot of sort of minor crowd anime and manga series that basically never go mainstream. But just because they don't go mainstream doesn't mean they have a very small market and doesn't go anywhere, right? Even with a niche crowd who is supporting and following your particular anime or manga, these content can still be developed, right? And this is not just because the author would have sufficient sort of income from continuing production based on a very enthusiastic crowd. It's also because the enthusiastic crowd by themselves will create additional content that the author would never have originally thought of, right? So these original content will help expand the universe of these anime and manga series in a horizontal fashion that I don't see, at least to the same scale outside of Japan. So these original sort of basically user-created content is what really develops a particular manga series or anime series in Japan as opposed to it is the case in other countries.
You're not wrong on this, and I think the same thing can be said for the Western states. When people think of DC heroes, the first character to immediately pop up would be Batman or Superman. But that's because they keep pushing it up, whether it's the several Batman or Superman's television series or the films. Like at this point, a common question among fans is, who's your favorite Batman and or Superman? As far as Batman goes, I personally will be a Kevin Conroy fan, God rest his soul. But that's not going to be the same within every household because it really shows what's more popular and what is not. My question is, as far as anime goes, you mentioned Pokemon a lot. Are there any other anime you're either familiar with, believe represent Japanese culture well, or you would recommend to someone from the States?
Yeah, I think I don't really follow anime too often these days, but a lot of the sort of oldies but goodies kind of animes are still worth watching for what they are in terms of their historical significance. I mean, Dragon Ball Z is definitely a good example that you mentioned, right? Dragon Ball Z has its significant historical significance because it takes not just from Japanese mythology, but it also takes from Chinese mythology as well. The whole sort of novel on the journey to the West is sort of where the original character of Son Goku comes from, right? So how he borrows from different historical sources and then layer that with a new sort of concept, a sort of new world on top of that, and try to create one that is relatable, not just to a Japanese audience, but to a global audience. I think it represents a huge breakthrough for the Japanese anime and manga industry, right? Until then, a lot of the sort of the Japanese anime and mangas that were created has an exclusive sort of a focus on Japanese social and cultural phenomenon, right? Or it might not be located in Japan, but people needed to have a certain sort of underlying understanding of how Japanese people behave, how Japanese people think, in order to understand a lot of the context, right? Dragon Ball Z wasn't like that, right? Of course, there are, certain behavioral cues that suggest we're still talking about a Japanese author targeting a Japanese audience. But because, it is a more simpler storyline of good versus evil and a higher goal with a very clear mission, it sort of transcends cultural boundaries in ways that many other anime and manga of the time are not able to do. So that sort of universalization of sort of manga and anime content, I think, is really something that's historical and something that is still very relevant today.
Well, you're not wrong, but in my experience, Toriyama is better with character designs and gag manga than he is with overall plot and story structure. I still to this day don't know how Bulma and Vegeta actually became a couple. And at this point in my life, I don't ever think I will. I think it just happened.
Yeah.
So there is this one fan theory that Vegeta was actually a wish. Bulma actually did wish to find a boyfriend, and then that's how the Saiyan saga essentially started.
Wow. Huh. Interesting. Yeah.
But Dragon Ball Z is definitely an interesting case, but because as far as anime goes, it's definitely a household name. Even if, or if you would just say its original source, just Dragon Ball, which if anything was more Journey to the West's similarity than the Dragon Ball Z counterpart.
Yeah.
But
Indeed. Yeah.
but it's no secret that many anime today do take place in Japan. Chainsaw Man is definitely one of those. Demon Slayer, but more of a feudal-esque, or even the Ghibli films. Many of them take place in Japan. My personal favorite of the bunch, of course, being Princess Mononoke. Now, do you believe Ghibli films are a good gateway for people getting into anime?
That's a good question. Even within the Japanese context, Studio Ghibli is a completely different animal from your common sort of anime and manga series. Partly this is because of how Studio Ghibli is very rigid and very exclusive in terms of how it controls intellectual property. So it's very difficult for what I just mentioned of fans to create their own original content, add to the universe of Ghibli films and Ghibli content, right? Of course, they can do whatever they want to do, but they'll never become part of the canon, and the author might not really take into account what their fans are doing and incorporate those into the overall storyline. And of course, Ghibli films tend to be distinct from each other in that they all take place in different worlds and have different storylines. And we might allude to some connections among some of them, but those connections are never too clear. And that is a deliberate attempt, right, by Studio Ghibli to create sort of mystical worlds that are separate from one another. And that is a little bit different from, a lot of the anime and manga series that we see today. For a lot of, especially considering Japan's, sort of aging and declining population, a lot of the new anime and manga, they tend to refer to previously successful anime and manga series in order to latch onto previous success in order to, themselves succeed, right? So that is a common feature that we see a lot, even especially in a lot of sort of the niche crowd manga that has a certain target audience that tend to be not so universal, right? So with Studio Ghibli, they don't do a lot of that, right? So how Ghibli develops its content tends to be quite different and quite unique, right? So people don't really think of Ghibli as part of the manga world or the anime world. It's like a different world. It's the Ghibli world. Yeah.
That does make sense. And from what I've noticed, a lot of them do have more Western themes to them, whether it be the case of Porco Rosso, Howl's Moving Castle, or even one of my personal favorites, The Cat Returns, have more of a Western feel to them, even though you can tell it was animated in Japan.
Right.
But from what I've noticed, anime in Japan in general doesn't do a lot of reboots as compared to the States. Like, the only ones off the top of my head I can really think of are Full Metal Alchemist, and then Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, the new, apologize if I butcher this, but Yurusei Yatsura, that was another one that got rebooted, but that was more recently, and after several decades. Why do you think that Japan doesn't do reboots to the same degree the States does?
Yeah, I think it sort of comes from the society's expectations of how manga is created and how anime is created, right? There are so many aspiring manga artists, in particular in Japan, that there are always somebody, right, who is coming out of nowhere to create a very successful series about a completely new topic that people, basically did not know before, right? Before the series, the person was a nobody. And after the series go viral, then, the person becomes famous. And this happens quite often. And it is especially true in more of the niche crowds of people who are looking for specific types and specific themes in their manga. So that is the fact that people always expect the next big breakthrough, next big artist to show up out of nowhere, is probably one reason why people don't reflect back on what is there in the past to look for new content. That's one reason. I think the other reason is out of the respect for the original author of a particular manga series, for instance. Right. So for some really old manga series that have been running for, say, 20, 30, 40 years, right, the original author has basically passed away by the time the manga series comes to an end, comes to a conclusion. People would believe that manga is only true and only genuine if it's written and drawn by the original author. So it is sort of like oil paintings, right? If you make an oil painting that is similar to, say, a Van Gogh, right? But you're not Van Gogh. So whatever you make might be similar to what Van Gogh painted in the past, but you're not Van Gogh, so it's only a forgery. I think a lot of Japanese people take the same sort of idea for manga, right? It's considered art that belongs exclusively to the original author. So if a new person comes along and draws something similar or continues the story, it's not considered genuine. It's basically considered forgery.
That's an interesting and well put. I haven't heard a comparison like that since I've compared both foxes and sandwiches to dragons in my dragon episode. And I know that does sound a little weird. But for those of you that didn't catch my dragon episode, I compare them as this. Foxes in the West are more evil creatures, whether you see them in Pinocchio or any of the other myriads of already existing fairy tales where the fox is always sneaky, trying to
Mm,
trick someone or trying to eat someone. Where they're in the East, they're more mystical creatures. And I've also
yeah.
compared them to sandwiches because in the East, you guys have a fine line on what is and what is not a sandwich. Where in the West, we'll just accept anything as a sandwich as long as bread is involved. We got your
Right,
Reubens, your
right.
Monte Cristos, your Patty
Yeah,
Melts, etc.,
yeah,
etc., etc.
yeah.
But
It's a good point. Yeah.
but for any anime fan that would like to visit Japan, hopefully in the near future, what would you recommend for them? I've heard 7-Eleven is a big deal over there.
7-Eleven, yes. Well, convenience stores in general are big deals here. In the US, you might only see convenience stores as something that's attached to a gas station. Over here, that's completely different, right? You can find them in every street corner in every major city in the country. And they're always open 24 hours, 365 days a year. Right, you can always buy your snacks, your microwavable meals, and sometimes books and stationery and frozen food, your drinks, alcohol, etc., from your local convenience store. The point is, you have your local convenience store and you'll be able to get everything that you need to live your daily life without having to make the trek out to like a bigger supermarket that will have shorter hours and probably are more distant from you geographically speaking. So yeah, convenience store is a big deal, and that's I guess the general point. For people who enjoy manga and anime, I guess this is a very common advice. But going to the Tokyo neighborhood of Akihabara is always a good starting point. That's because a lot of the geeks descend upon the neighborhood not sometimes to buy certain content that's available, sometimes to buy electronics for which the neighborhood has a lot of stores, but often it's just to get together. The neighborhood has a lot of cafes. Maid cafes is a good example of young women basically serving men drinks, nothing sexual. It's mostly just for fun. But there are also just regular cafes where just a lot of people who are interested in manga and anime would get together and they would share their stories, share their interests, and share a lot of the original content that they created by themselves. So you be able to see the whole anime and manga community basically in action in these cafes, where they're always exchanging information, exchanging ideas about how to expand the universe of their favorite manga anime series, and exchanging information about a new manga and anime series that people might not know about yet because it's so niche, right? So people who are really interested in this field will be able to discover a lot of these new artists and new content coming up that is not yet available in your regular media platforms. Yeah, so that's always a good place to start.
Interesting. But as far as non-anime based tourism attractions go, what would you recommend? I've always wanted to check out a hot spring there, get really more submerged into Japanese culture. Do you think that would
Yeah,
be a good place to start?
I guess if for people who have never been to a Japanese hot spring, it probably requires an explanation. But hot springs are natural volcanic heated water that springs out of the ground. But what is unique about Japanese hot springs is that you're supposed to go in naked, right? It's communal bath. So you take a shower right before you jump into the big pool of hot water. But you're basically, if you're a man, you'll be doing that with a lot of other naked men around you, right? And this big pool of hot water will contain a lot of other naked men while you're submerged in it as well. So whether people are comfortable with this kind of lack of privacy varies from person to person. I'm sure a lot of people are not used to it. And I would suggest that you go for a hot spring only if you're comfortable with this kind of situation of seeing a lot of nude people around you, right? So
Well, that
that's one.
basically describes any football player who grew up playing football in high school. They're clearly
Right.
comfortable around being around each other naked. Yeah, they're even comfortable tackling each other. So clearly, I don't think a hot spring would present as an issue to them. But that's just my
Yeah.
2 cents with you.
Yeah, unfortunately, not everybody has played sports growing up, so a lot of people might be quite not used to the idea of seeing so many naked people. But yes,
I've
I
done
guess
this
if you're
before, so here's my inspiration. Bathing with somebody naked is a lot like crossing a bridge off a high platform. Don't
uh-huh.
look down.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, eye to eye, not looking down. Yeah, that's very important. Let's see. I guess what else would be interesting in Japan for some just general travel advice that is not strictly related to anime or manga. I think one thing that would be very interesting, and this is probably advice that you rarely hear from other people, is that you should get away from major tourist destinations. You should get away from major cities where a lot of tourists go and check out very provincial towns, small cities, and even villages in Japan, right? A lot of these, because Japan has a very good bus and train network, a lot of these can be easily reachable even without a private car. And sometimes these towns offer a better sort of perspective on how everyday Japanese life works, right? Away from the tourist spots. People, of course, do their day-to-day life, right? There might not be convenience stores, but there might be a lot of vegetable and meat markets that you can check out, right? And you might not be able to see a lot of skyscrapers, but you be able to see, your regular elementary and high schools in action, see how kids learn in provincial towns, right? There won't be a lot of tourist destinations, but you can see how the villagers or the townies interact with one another in a lot of the towns, community centers where they, just come and talk, have lunch with each other, and maybe play games with one another. So seeing this daily life in action is something that I feel would be very valuable for people who are coming to Japan for the very first time.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned tourism. What I'm going to ask you is probably either going to make or break this conversation. Do you believe tourism is good for Japan? Because from what I've noticed from Japan, it's a very restricted country.
Yeah. So I think there is a big issue with tourism that is regularly talked about in Japan is that the distribution of tourism is very unbalanced. A lot of tourists from foreign countries that come to Japan go to a few places, right? Kyoto, obviously, it's a very popular destination for its historical temples, just historical feel, right? But Kyoto is a city of just a million people, right? So if you get a lot of tourists, it feels like you see more tourists than locals, right? And the whole town feels very, very touristed. But and the same goes for certain neighborhoods in Tokyo, right? The neighborhood of Akihabara that I just mentioned gets a lot of tourists as well. Of course, it gets a lot of locals as well, but a lot of tourists go there for its reputation in pop culture. So if you go to an area like that, you are prone to see a lot of places that are catering specifically to tourists. It loses its original clientele of basically Japanese people who are just there for their everyday life. So you're prone to see Japan through the prism of a tourist crowd or the tourist industry without actually being able to understand how people live on a day-to-day basis. And that is why I just recommend people go away from the tourist spot to these provincial towns and rural villages to see how people generally live.
Well,
Because,
it sounds like
tourist,
Kakibara, the place you're talking about, sounds a lot like
right.
the America's equivalent of Manhattan or San Diego. So I do agree
Yeah.
with you on that. And quick shout out to my friend Rachel. The best pecan pie I've ever had was made for my friend Rachel. Every time we do a convention, whether it be Otakon or Anime NYC, she always brings and makes the best pecan pies I've ever had. Much better than I can get at any Marie Callender's or even at some diners, because she actually hand makes the crusts.
Nice.
So I do agree with
Nice.
you. I do feel, and this is one of the issues I have with mainstream, where it's not just
Mm,
media, but it's also location. People get
yeah.
too absorbed, engulfed in what's really popular that they just don't take the time to smell the roses.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
So with this said, yes, this has been Vacationing for Geeks in Japan. Zhao Chen, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to swing by today.
Thank you very much, Tyler, for your time.
One more time, what do you do, who you are, and where you can be found?
My name is Shelton. I'm based in Tokyo, Japan, and I work as a business consultant. You can find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and Facebook, the link of which will be included in the description below.
I'll let you know when this episode airs so you can send me all that fun little stuff if you want to catch Zhao Chen for your next podcast. But keep in mind, if you are in the States, there's a big time zone between here and Japan.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, indeed.
but hey, at least this shows the Earth isn't flat. But with that, I'm also going to leave you a joke. The Earth is also flat. Would you like to know why?
Why?
The Earth is made of 70% water, but none of it is
Mhm.
carbonated.
Nice. Very
So with
nice.
that, this is the what you should do if you'd like to vacation for Japan. What you'd like to know about, the anime worth seeing to get inspired by Japan. Check out the not only the popular stuff, but the smaller places just to smell the roses. Whatever you do,
Indeed.
remember one thing: stay geeky.